Cleopatra. To the world, she was a goddess draped in gold, the last pharaoh of Egypt, seductress of emperors, a woman whose name survives like a flame licking through centuries of dust. But history has a habit of lighting up the stage while keeping the shadows silent. And in those shadows, behind the throne, beneath the perfume and political theater, children suffered in silence. They were palace slaves, imported, branded, forgotten. Some were taken from Nubian villages after raids. Others were handed over as tribute from Judean and Syrian nobles, bartered like coin in the games of diplomacy. A few were born inside the palace walls, children of slaves who had no name beyond the inventory scrolls. Boys as young as 6, girls barely past infancy. Greek administrative records from the Ptolemaic court list them plainly, not by name, but as property. Some were marked for menial labor, others for ritual duties. But the most refined? They were selected for Cleopatra's inner sanctum, the queen's private court. And there, the rituals began. Renaming, rehousing, reconditioning. Some of the boys were castrated, a brutal custom borrowed from Persian and Egyptian court traditions, still quietly preserved in Alexandria's inner palace. The body was reshaped to meet the palace's expectations, obedient, beautiful, and above all, harmless. They became eunuchs, concubines, instruments of decorum and pleasure. Within the alabaster maze of Cleopatra's palace, they walked silently, draped in linen and silk, eyes always lowered, hands always folded, trained to serve without trace. You'll read of Cleopatra's charm, of her wit, her intellect, her elegance, but few scrolls speak of the dozens, perhaps hundreds, of children who lived and died beneath her gaze, unseen. They slept in stone rooms behind bronze doors, breathed incense, ate little, cried quietly, watched one another vanish, punished, reassigned, or simply erased. This was empire at its most seductive and its most merciless. This is not the story of a queen. This is the story of those who vanished behind her. No empire expands without sacrifice. And Egypt, even in its final desperate century under Cleopatra, demanded tribute far beyond coin. It needed bodies. In the 1st century BCE, the Ptolemaic state was unraveling. Debts to Rome were rising, revolts flared in the south. And yet the court in Alexandria remained gilded, fueled by grain exports, taxes, and a constant influx of human lives. Children were among the most valuable. Slave markets in Ephesus, Cyrene, and the Levant stayed stocked. Syrian girls for domestic labor, Thracian boys for palace service, and dark-skinned Nubians, prized for their exotic beauty. We know this not from dramatic tales, but from papyrus receipts. Faded Greek ink recording purchases like, one boy, aged approximately 9, was purchased for service to the queen's inner court. Healthy, no blemishes. These were real transactions, real children. Some were orphans from frontier villages. Still others were spoils from Egypt's last military campaigns along the Upper Nile, handed over like trophies. Most were transported by ship, packed below deck, chained in silence. Others were marched in caravans across desert and scrubland, arriving in Alexandria sunburned, barefoot, and disoriented. The youngest would cry. The older ones had already learned not to. Upon arrival, they weren't sent to slave pens, but to the palace complex, a city within a city, where they were washed, examined, renamed. And for many boys, this was where the body ceased to belong to them. Temple records and Hellenistic medical manuals confirm castration, though officially outlawed in parts of the Greek world, was still practiced inside elite Egyptian households. Not all boys were mutilated, but some were, especially those selected for service in Cleopatra's personal quarters, or in the harems of the noble class. It was called preservation, a way to make them safe, pure, controllable, and permanently alienated from adult masculinity. The procedures were often crude, rushed. Survival was not guaranteed. The lucky ones healed with scars. The unlucky bled out in silence, their names never recorded again. And to the palace, this was not a tragedy. It was a procedure. What followed was schooling, not in letters or law, but in obedience. The boys were separated by language and age, taught Greek, bathed daily, shaved, oiled, and dressed in linen tunics, trained to walk without noise, to speak only when spoken to bow low when passing high-born guests, to make eye contact only when asked. Hieroglyphic murals from earlier dynasties show smiling servant children holding perfume jars, fans, scrolls. But behind those images was a curriculum of subservience, enforced with ritual punishments, isolation, and public beatings when obedience wavered. Some boys resisted. They were beaten, branded, or locked in stone cells. One surviving court account, written not by a slave, but by a Greek official, describes a boy who bit a royal guard during bathing protocol. He was never seen again. Others adapted. They mimicked their instructors. They learned to read shifts in tone, the flicker of danger behind a master's smile. They learned how to survive by becoming whatever the palace needed them to be. And through it all, the Queen's court carried on, with feasts, ambassadors, parades. While Cleopatra negotiated with Caesar, and later Antony, while scrolls were written proclaiming her wisdom and beauty, while crowds roared for her appearances, these children moved silently through the corridors of power, unseen, untouched by history. From the outside, the royal palace of Alexandria was a marvel, a fusion of Greek symmetry and Egyptian grandeur, columns of white limestone, courtyards perfumed with myrrh and blue lotus, walls adorned with golden friezes and glass mosaics that shimmered beneath the Mediterranean sun. But for the children brought into its heart, this place was no marvel. It was a maze, a prison, gilded with ceremony. Palace slaves, especially boys assigned to the Queen's private service, lived under strict hierarchies. Greek was the official tongue. The children were renamed, often after gods or stars, their original identities quietly erased. They were organized by age, skill, and appearance. The most attractive, docile, and quick-witted were promoted to chamber attendants, permitted to serve in the Queen's wing or at royal banquets. The rest performed more menial roles, preparing oils, grinding cosmetics, sweeping marble floors before dawn. Historical sources are fragmentary, but they suggest a rigid schedule. Pre-dawn ablutions, overseen by eunuch supervisors. Inspection rituals, where bodies were examined for fitness, cleanliness, and signs of disobedience. Service rotations, where children stood motionless for hours during court ceremonies. Trained to remain still even when exhausted or ill, their existence was orchestrated. Bodies controlled, emotions suppressed, words rationed. Punishments for error were swift and public. One Greco-Egyptian scroll from a priest's archive mentions a boy reassigned to temple service after speaking out of turn. Temple service, in this case, likely meant ritual confinement or permanent exile to a distant outpost, a polite euphemism for disappearance. Cleopatra herself was rarely seen by these boys. She lived cloaked in protocol, encircled by high officials, priests, and foreign dignitaries. But her preferences shaped everything, from the children's dress codes to the tone of the servants' voices. Some ancient visitors left behind cryptic accounts. A Roman scribe described the processions of silent boys, their heads shaved, their eyes cast downward, attending to Cleopatra and her guests with graceful indifference. But what they called grace was survival. Inside the dormitories, tucked behind courtyards and screened from public view, life was quieter, but no less brutal. The children slept in rows, on low reed mats or stone platforms. Oil lamps flickered on the walls, casting long shadows. There was little privacy, little rest. Older servants enforced rules with cruelty passed down to them. Initiation rituals were common, not out of tradition, but as tools of control. Some children, especially those marked as favored, were groomed for more intimate service. Greek poetry from the court era hints at relationships between masters and attendants, cloaked in the language of affection, but dripping with possession. One preserved verse describes a boy with ankles like lilies, eyes like sleep, gifted to a visiting nobleman as tribute from the queen's house. No records tell us how the boy felt. No records had to. This was a system, inherited, polished, and protected. The child's silence was expected, his suffering irrelevant. By the time they turned 14, many of these boys had been reshaped entirely. Some developed a performative charm, praised for their grace and poise. Others became emotionally withdrawn, their spirits numbed by years of surveillance and quiet coercion. Either path was acceptable to the palace. What mattered was loyalty, discretion, obedience, because inside these walls, surrounded by opulence and incense, beauty was not a blessing, it was a burden, and those who bore it did so alone. You were 12, maybe 13. Your voice was changing. Your limbs had grown long and lean. You had learned to walk in silence, to blend into shadow. You had become exactly what the palace wanted: useful, present, handsome, obedient. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because in Cleopatra's Alexandria, power didn't only move through coins or armies. It moved through whispers. It moved through bodies. The scrolls speak of Cleopatra's affairs with Caesar and Antony, monumental liaisons that shaped empires. But they rarely mention how minor alliances were made and maintained in quieter ways, through gifts, through tribute, through you. Historical letters between Roman envoys and the Ptolemaic court mention hospitality gifts, young attendants sent to charm guests, flatter foreign nobles, serve at elite banquets. Some were merely decorative, others were not. No records survive from the boys. Patterns emerge between the lines of official correspondence. Your man was most graciously received, a Roman official writes. The boy assigned to him was well-trained, compliant. His presence spoke volumes of Egyptian refinement. These weren't compliments. They were acknowledgments, coded confirmations that Alexandria still understood the rules of imperial diplomacy. You were never told outright, but you understood. The glances, the veiled instructions, the gentle hand on your shoulder before you were led to a guest chamber and told to make yourself agreeable. You didn't ask questions. No one ever did. To resist was to disappear. To consent meant survival. So you endured the long nights, the breath that wasn't yours, the touch that blurred your skin into numbness. Sometimes, afterward, you'd sneak back to your corner of the dormitory and scrub yourself raw, trying to remove the scent. But nothing could remove the knowledge. You have become currency. It wasn't seen as cruelty. It was ordered. A system honed through dynasties, one that turned children into tools, pain into protocol. The eunuchs knew. They had been you once. Now, they trained younger boys. How to smile on command, how to stay silent even when your soul wants to scream. They weren't kind, but they weren't monsters either. They were survivors, warped by the same machine they now helped maintain. Even Cleopatra, for all her intellect and political genius, never spoke of you. You saw her only in glimpses, veiled in indigo, perfumed in blue lotus, eyes rimmed in kohl. She moved like a goddess. To the world, she was one. But you knew better. You knew she walked on the backs of children, and that her throne, that dazzling, gilded thing, was built on bones. By the time you reached your 14th year, the palace had trained you well. Your native tongue was a fading echo. Your body moved with mechanical grace. Your eyes stayed low. Your smile was practiced. But deep inside, a part of you still remembered. A riverbank in Judea, lullaby in Thrace, the taste of pomegranate in Nubia. You remembered who you were before you were bought. And that memory, quiet, flickering, fragile, was the only thing they had never been able to take. You thought you had adapted, that if you were clever enough, quiet enough, perfect enough, you might survive without losing yourself entirely. But survival in the palace was not a destination. It was a slow erosion, a daily ritual of disappearing. Because every day something was taken. One day it was your name, next your laughter, then your language, your innocence, your trust, and finally something even deeper, the belief that you were still a person. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It began in small, invisible ways. Your body refused food. You stopped speaking unless prompted. You woke from dreams of burning fields and bleeding skies, unable to remember if they were memories or hallucinations. You saw it happening in others too. A boy from Cyprus who refused to bathe, a Nubian boy who stared blankly at the wall for days, then vanished. No explanation was ever given. Even the eunuchs began to look through you. Not out of cruelty, but because they recognized the signs. They had reached this place once too. Some had clawed their way back. Others hadn't. You were cracking, and the palace noticed. They responded the way all systems of power do, with protocol. First, reassignment. You were pulled from chamber service and sent to the incense storerooms beneath the temple wing, a place reeking of resin, sweat, and secrecy. The air was heavy, no windows, just rows of clay jars and cold stone. A boy once told you that anyone reassigned here was either being punished or prepared. Prepared for what? No one said. The silence in the storeroom was unbearable. No voices, no orders, no human contact. Only the echo of your own breath, and the sickening thought that perhaps this was the end of your usefulness. And if you were no longer useful, what happened to you then? There were rumors that some boys were drowned, discreetly. Others sold to less refined masters in the countryside. Some, it was said, were offered as ritual servants in cultic ceremonies, sacrifices in all but name. These stories were whispered at night, when the oil lamps burned low and fear pressed down like a second skin. You tried not to believe them, but belief had long stopped mattering in this place. One night, you finally broke. You struck a steward who tried to touch you. Your hand moved before your brain did. A flash of heat, instinct, something ancient and furious rising from inside your chest. There was silence, then chaos. You were dragged through marble corridors, your feet scraping mosaic tiles. Your tunic is torn, beaten, stripped, locked in a chamber barely larger than a coffin. No food, no light, just darkness, and the sound of your own heart, still thudding with the terrifying realization you had fought back. For a moment, it almost felt like freedom. They didn't kill you. Perhaps you were still worth something. Or perhaps Cleopatra's court had grown distracted. Rome pressing in, the queen's alliances fraying. Or maybe, just maybe, the empire had already taken the part of you it needed. What was left no longer mattered. You emerged days later, not as a boy, but as a hollowed version of one. Your skin healed, your limbs still moved. But inside, something had turned to ash. You weren't alone. You saw the same look in others, in the scribe who never blinked, in the kitchen boy who hummed to himself at night, in the guard who once knelt and wept behind a pillar. This palace, with its gold and its gods and its grandeur, was a tomb, not of the dead, but of the still living. There was no ceremony for your erasure, no trumpet to announce the final taking of your name, no scroll to record the last time you wept as yourself. The palace didn't need to mark the moment it finished breaking you. It had done so carefully, over years, with quiet rituals, silk-wrapped commands, and gold-framed cruelty. Now, it simply reclassified you, from child slave to state asset, from attendant to functionary, from you to nothing at all. Once, when you were still learning the rules, you believed freedom might come at the end of service, that one day you might walk out of these halls and reclaim what had been stolen. But you've since learned there is no returning. Those who aged out of usefulness were often reassigned to Alexandria's temples or sent into the bureaucratic engine of the state, the customs house, the naval docks, the census offices. Technically, they were freed. In practice, they simply moved. From one chamber of the same labyrinth to another, your own transition came quietly. You were summoned to a chamber where a scribe recorded your new title, archive assistant, Greek division. They handed you a new garment. They didn't ask if you were ready. No one ever asked. You stepped out of the dormitory one last time, past the oil lamps, past the stone cistern, past the other boys who did not look up from their quiet suffering. You didn't say goodbye. What would you say? You weren't leaving. You were being absorbed deeper into the machine. And Cleopatra? She never knew your name. To her, you were one of many. One of the boys who opened her parasol at festivals, who ground coal in the early hours, who bore silent witness to the whispered negotiations that held empires in balance. Her legacy is eternal, etched in marble, chiseled in myth, wrapped in perfumes and papyri. But your legacy? It ended on a reed-thin, buried in a clerical ledger, lost in a flood, or burned during the Roman sack. And yet, you were real as the cold tiles beneath your feet, as real as the priest's hand that slaps your cheek, as real as the breath you held each time the doors creaked open. You do not appear in history, but you lived it. You were it. The palace still stands. Tourists drift through its reconstructed rooms, marveling at murals, asking questions about Cleopatra's jewels, her lovers, her politics. The guides speak of opulence, diplomacy, divinity. They do not speak of you. No one tells them that beneath those polished stones lie the ghosts of children who never left. Boys like you, boys who were taken, boys who were used, and whose stories, unwritten, unrecorded, were the price of an empire. You were never meant to be remembered, not by name, not by deed, not in any royal scroll or temple wall. You were a shadow behind the throne, a pair of silent hands smoothing silk, a soft pair of eyes, trained never to meet another's gaze. Cleopatra's story endures, a queen, a strategist, a lover of emperors. Her death is recorded in dozens of languages. Her face was immortalized in stone. Her choices were studied, debated, and rewritten. But your death? It was silent, unmarked, maybe from a fever, maybe from age, maybe from despair. There was no inscription, no funeral rite. Your passing registered only as an empty bed, a shuffled roster, a name crossed out in charcoal. And yet, you mattered, because every empire built on beauty and gold is also built on silence, and every silence holds the weight of the forgotten, The marble halls still gleam in museums. But marble remembers everything. It remembers the sobs behind closed doors, the smell of blood masked by incense, the footsteps of a boy who once dreamed of escape and learned instead how to survive. So let the world speak endlessly of Cleopatra. Let her legend shimmer in silver and verse. But let your story, the story of the thousands who served, suffered, and vanished beneath her reign, haunt the corners of that legacy. Because while history crowned a queen, it buried the children,